candle burns at both ends, it will not last the night. But ah, my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light.
Hello, lovelies. I'm recording this on the morning after the US election, so I will be honest with you, I'm not much in the mood to be doing much of anything, but I figure people need escapism regardless. And the best thing I can do is just to keep going. The best thing any of us can do is keep going in our own little ways. And I know some of my audience will be very happy and will be lolling. I just remind you that democracy assumes that the common people know what they want and gives it to them good and hard, to paraphrase Mencken. Yeah, I think it's just worth noting. But anyway, it's kind of fitting that I'm looking at some Fabula Ultima stuff today. So I got the GM's kit and the Techno fantasy book as they became available here in the UK abruptly. Ordered them from Modiphius, but it was fulfilled through Zatu for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. Anyway, the GM material was the GM screen and a little GM booklet, and then the Techno Fantasy book is, it's an Atlas book. It's similar to the High Fantasy one. So the GM screen is kind of interesting, I guess. It's short format, so it's not much use as an actual screen. The artwork is good, but not necessarily quite up to the standard of the original core book. I think it's lent more into the cutesy Final Fantasy IX. I think that's right. Anyway, sort of style on the front. On the back, however, it is an extremely useful GM screen. It definitely does have pretty much all the information you would want or need. So it's more useful, I think, as a reference. So if you fold it like that, keep it nearby and flip through it like a book, I think it would be more useful than actually as a GM screen, because you ain't hiding any rolls or anything behind this. The cardstock is very thick, very durable, so on that score it does very well. The Games Master's booklet with it mostly isn't hugely useful unless you're a noob to running games. A lot of the advice is kind of generic. I mean, it's good advice, but let's face it, for most people, Fabula Ultima is not going to be their first role-playing game, so a lot of this information is fairly redundant. Where it becomes useful, I think, is in gauging challenges and battles for the players, the additional rules and ideas on creating NPCs and monsters, and providing tools and generators for gimmicks, skills, devices, other oddness. You know, that's where it really shines. So it's only a minority of the material in here is particularly useful, unless you're an absolute noob, in which case it's a fairly good, decent, concise GM advice. So that's the GM kit. It's the screen and this little booklet. I think I would have preferred if they'd also brought in a bunch of the online stuff that they've published, extra character classes, things like that. If they'd put that into the book as well and made it useful to players as well, I think that would have been better. But okay, so if I were to score this one, I would say style, low 4. I think there's not a great deal in the way of illustration in the GM book, mostly reused, I think. And I don't hugely like the style they've gone for the GM screen, but you know, these are both mostly reference materials, so you don't need a huge amount of presentation, so hence a low 4. In terms of substance, the GM screen is a useful reference. Most of the booklet isn't particularly useful unless you're a noob, as I said. So content-wise, yeah, 3, I suppose. I wasn't surprised or encouraged by anything particular on the GM screen, and like I say, a lot of the content in the book not actually that helpful, useful, or essential. So yeah, that gives that a 7 out of 10 or a 3.5 out of 5. If you're a noob, I'd add a point to that score, because the sort of general advice in here is useful, and if you're the sort of games master that struggles with systems and system implications, then the value goes up a lot there as well. Alright, now this is the second atlas. The first one was high fantasy. This one is the techno fantasy one. Going into this, I was expecting more of a Final Fantasy VII sort of feel to it, or a Final Fantasy VI sort of feel to it. You know, Magitech, but relatively fairly low key, and so on. This isn't that. They seem to have aimed a bit higher. It makes me think more of Phantasy Star, or maybe Star Ocean, or yeah, others of those more high-tech, more science fiction oriented games and series. So it very much seems to be in that sort of mold more, though you can bring things back and scale things back, and there is definitely a lot of Final Fantasy VII influence here. I also found it rather heavy-handed, or too heavy-handed, or too fixated upon certain ideas that they more strongly associate with techno fantasy than I would necessarily associate with techno fantasy. Themes of inequality and oppression, overarching political and social powers and groups that control and dominate. Which, sure, that's a common theme in a lot of technological games, fantasy games of a darker bent, cyberpunk, and so on, and it's definitely a theme in Final Fantasy VII, but to focus the book so much on those sorts of ideas doesn't really fit for me necessarily, and so it all felt a bit heavy-handed. We do get a bunch of locations, but as with the high fantasy book, there's not really enough information for you to make huge use of these things, which is somewhat unfortunate. But there are interesting ideas that you could build out a setting from, I suppose. But again, they all seem rather more high-tech than I would think would be where you would aim things. I was expecting more of a focus on the fantasy than the techno, but that's not how things worked out in the book for whatever reason. So we get into conflicts. Now, this is something I bang on about a lot. A lot of modern games seem to lack an understanding of what drives story, which does tend to be conflict. You know, man against man, man against nature, man against circumstance, whatever. The stories emerge about how people overcome their enemies or their opposition or whatever it is. And again, there is just an overbearing focus on oppression and control and so on, which isn't always present in the source material that they're going for, but they really kind of over-focus on it, I think. Now, one thing where this really kind of leaps out, particularly to me as being a good addition to the game system and the world, is vehicles and mecha. Now, these aren't hugely mechanically deep, but they are covered, and in a way that is useful and usable to you in the game. So it's eminently useful. One of the first games I ever created was drawing a great deal of inspiration from Escaflowne. Cloak of Steel was largely based off ideas that came to me while watching Escaflowne and wanting to combine Western and Eastern fantasy elements together. And so having the mecha rules there is something that's incredibly useful to me and something that very, very much interests me. Mechanically, it's not hugely deep. You basically have a frame of a particular size. That size influences how you interact with the world, and that frame can then have options built onto it. But it's not like Mechton or anything like that. But equally, it is not as vague as, say, the current crop of Robotech books are. So it's somewhere in the middle. And I think that possibly works best. You could easily add more mechanical depth if you wanted to, or you could strip the mechanical depth back if you wanted to. And so that would work. Much of the rest of how it interacts with the rules, magic, technology, and so on, are additional or different rules options or interpretations, or a matter of flavor. So what might be magical in one setting could be technological in another, but mechanically at root, it all works the same. Any sufficiently gamified technology is indistinguishable from gamified magic, I suppose you might be able to say. But it does provide some more options, and you can always bring some techno-fantasy elements into a fantasy setting, or vice versa, and the rule system is simple enough that is simple enough. We get some new techno-fantasy oriented hero types. They give example heroes with this chibi style artwork. Now, I've got nothing against chibi style art. This is slightly off. It doesn't feel like authentic Japanese chibi style artwork, and it's a shame to use chibi style artwork in what is presented as a more gritty and emotionally relatable and authentic setting. It kind of undermines the feel for a lot of it, and I don't think it's particularly well executed. I don't think that was a good choice here. You do get new character options: psychics, mutants, and pilots, which is okay. Maybe we could have done with a few more, like a rebel, perhaps, or a security officer, or those sorts of things. I would have liked to have seen more Phantasy Star influence, I think, in terms of robot races, things like that. But you do get some new options for character types like intelligent animals, things like that. Quirks are things you can do to alter your character and customize them further, but they do tend to make characters a little bit more powerful. So it's a bit of that 5th edition style power creep starting to happen there. But I like increased character customization, so I don't particularly have any issue with that. Technospheres are basically magic spheres, same as you will be familiar with from Final Fantasy VII. You can slot those into your equipment or your armor to give you access to abilities. You can trade them with others, all of that usual sort of thing. But again, that kind of potentially ups the power level through customization. So that's something you might need to compensate for if you bring it in to your game in any way. So here's the detail on the additional character types: your Esper, your Psychic, your Mutant with their strange capabilities. Yeah, so if you wanted to run something like Tokyo Gore Police or something, I guess you could have everyone playing mutants. You can also play disembodied, like computerized consciousnesses or AIs or whatever, so there are rules for that. Personal vehicles and customizations of those, so you get expanded vehicle types, which is going to be useful. Weapon modules are ways you can customize your vehicles. Support modules are other ways you can customize your vehicles. And then we get into some reference and ideas and expanded explanations of some of the bits and bobs. We get some rules for customizing villains suitable for a techno fantasy thing, and some examples of additional creatures and NPCs. I think they spend too much time on example heroic characters and example villains that could have been spent on more generic rules for creating them, or a more generic bestiary being expanded, but overall pretty good. Alright, so final scores on Fabula Ultima Techno Fantasy. Style wise, I think it's slightly a step down. The format is largely the same. Yeah, it's readable, it's clean, but the artwork is very much more of a mixed bag in this book than it has been in the previous couple of books, in my opinion, and based on my somewhat faulty and flaky memory. But it's still better than a lot of RPGs these days. It's got more character. You can see lines. It doesn't dissolve into sort of pastel mush like so much artwork does these days. You know, you can actually make out the figure and detail. So all of that, it's going to be a low for style. It would be slightly higher, but again, the heavy-handedness and the assumptions made in the game about the style of campaign that you were likely going to run is slightly obnoxious. Not as obnoxious as Cyber-Org, in it, you know, explicitly telling you can't play certain kinds of games in it, which leads me to stick my middle finger up to them largely. Not quite as heavy-handed as that, but still, the assumptions aren't sound, I don't think. In terms of substance, this does add a lot of good, useful stuff to the game, particularly if you want to run more mecha-style games. You know, this is very useful for you if you wanted to run Escaflowne. But it is aimed much more at the sci-fi side. I guess it needs to be, because you'd be repeating yourself. Yeah, but still, all those provisos and everything taken into account, it's going to be a 4 for substance as well. So that's 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5. If you like Fabula Ultima, if you play Fabula Ultima, then I think this is a very useful thing for you. And if you want to run a more sci-fi or tech fantasy game, then absolutely this is worth getting for Fabula Ultima. So there you go. Be safe out there. Zang. Imagination is a deeply personal game about depression and its effects, intended to help people with invisible illnesses to broach the subject and explore it in a way in which they can have power over it. Imagination is set after the fall of mainland Britain to a strange reality breakdown. The barriers between imagination and reality, dreams and nightmares, have shattered, and strange things dreamed up by people caught in the event teem across the land. Only those whose minds are already broken can hope to cope with exploring, understanding, and combating this strangeness for the sake of the huddled refugees that sit and wait and watch from the smaller islands around the coast. A game of mental illness and art using the description system as used in Neverwhere. This game is available free, so please promote, download, host and spread as far and wide as you can. Available at post-mort.com and drive-through RPG.
so ordinary. They watch the world with blind